Welcome to I Love the 80s, a talk show where we discuss pop culture, music, and cinema of the 1980s. Today we have a very special guest. Joshua Simonds' love affair with horror started when he was a kid, reading Stephen King novels and watching Nightmare on Elm Street. His love of all things scary stayed with him as he grew up and became a successful business owner. Today he's well known across Vermont and New Hampshire as an unofficial expert in horror. And he is here to talk about its place in the decades of the 80s. Please welcome our guest, Joshua Simonds. Thank you, Joshua, for coming on our show.
Great to be on your show, Isaac.
Great. I want to start off talking about your childhood and horror. Do you think that your love of scary things at such a young age affected the way you grew up?
I'd like to say that it hadn't really, but then I joined Toastmasters. No.
Well, I was going to say...
Just joking. I don't really think it did. I don't really think it did.
No? You weren't kind of a weird kid for it or anything? Or...
I think it was a weird kid before I fell into horror movies, not the other way around.
Oh,
so the cause and effect there might have been reversed.
All right. I guess that's fair enough. Well, one of the main reasons I wanted to bring you on the show today was to talk about your idea that horror movies were at their peak in the 1980s. Not only that, you inferred that they are the pinnacle of cinema history. Could you talk to us a little more about those ideas?
Absolutely. So horror movies in the 1980s combined everything great about our culture. Every genre can be found in a horror movie. We have romance, we have action, we have comedy, we have tragedy. We have all of these different genres collapsed into one generally 90-minute long movie. It's also the pinnacle because I'm a huge fan of the special effects that they did in the 1980s. I don't really care for the CGI effects that we find in movies nowadays. I believe it was an art form. When somebody was working on special effects, they really put everything that they had into it. Also, I believe it was the very first type of movie that really ushered in a strong feminist movement. And what I mean by this is, if you watch any of these horror movies from the 1980s, maybe from the 1970s as well, but mostly from the 1980s, the main protagonists were women. The heroes were women. They didn't wait around for men to save them. They were saving themselves. I always found that noteworthy.
Oh, the final girl syndrome. That's
Exactly what it is.
Yeah. All right. Well, I have to ask you, what is your favorite horror movie from the 1980s and why?
Nightmare on Elm Street.
Okay, the first one.
The very first one.
All right.
The very first one out of 10 or 12, I think there was. But it was one of the very first horror movies that I watched, and it was frightening. And I think horror movies appeal to me and most people, especially because they give us that escapist thrill, and we can appreciate being scared, but we also appreciate how safe we are in that moment and how safe our life is, generally speaking. Freddy Krueger was a great villain. He had a great story. You know, a group of parents killed him because he was an awful person. He also haunted these kids' dreams. That's a frightening thing right there. You know, we've all been frightened by our dreams. And the fact that he could get you through your dreams, there was no running away from that. Also, the protagonist, the hero of that story, was Nancy. And Nancy was a girl in high school, and she didn't wait around for her boyfriend to save her or any man to save her. She was out there doing the saving.
As I remember, her boyfriend met an untimely demise.
He did, and that was Johnny Depp.
That was, interestingly enough. Well, we had talked a little bit about cinema. I want to talk a little bit about the literature. You had mentioned that you had read Stephen King at a young age. How old were you when you were reading Stephen King?
Oh, I was 8 or 9.
Wow.
I was a big reader.
So
obviously my parents didn't really care.
So, would you say, I thought this would be an interesting question, would you say that Stephen King peaked in his career in the 1980s?
I don't know if peaked is the right way to say it. I will say that some of my favorite books of his came from the 1980s. It also corresponded from the same time that he was a major drug addict. So there's that as well. The 1980s, especially if you look at a lot of the movies, there's a lot of cocaine everywhere.
That's what I hear. So, well, thank you, Josh.
I saw your episode on cocaine.
We did we'll get into that again later. The 80s. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for coming on our show, Joshua. I'd like to have another round of applause for our guest. Catch us next week. We'll be discussing who affected the 80s more, Michael Jackson, Prince, or Madonna. Thank you, and have a good night.